Hello, welcome to Rogue Auteurs' ranking of Christopher Nolan's films. He has made 10 movies. He is considered one of the greatest filmmakers that we have working today. Myself and Jacob Hampton and Eric Wood are going to run down the order in which we rank his 10 movies. Here we go.
My number 10 is Following. Christopher Nolan's first film shows early signs of the qualities that I would later come to love about his work. Unfortunately, even though I'm fascinated by the concept of a man who loves to follow other people, the way it plays out just doesn't do it for me enough for me to love the film.
My number 10 is Following, made on a very small budget but nonetheless very effective. Following introduced Nolan's penchant for analyzing the psychological motivations of people through the story of a young man who likes following people, mostly because it just fascinates him, and a thief who takes an interest in that man.
My number 10 is Following. I have never seen Following. Easy number 10.
And my number 9 is Interstellar. Interstellar is one of Nolan's most ambitious stories, and it features a great score by Hans Zimmer, as well as pretty great performances, I think, from Matthew McConaughey, Jessica Chastain, and also Anne Hathaway. But for me, it was a little bit of an ambitious swing and a miss, getting more bogged down by the science than actually being elevated by understanding the science.
My number 9 is Batman Begins. I know that's a controversial choice, and I recognize that this isn't a bad film by any means, but it's far less interesting to me than the rest of the trilogy. Elements like the heavy emphasis on the Ra's al Ghul storyline and the trippiness of the Scarecrow hallucinations are things that just don't captivate me as well as the other movies, and that's why I have it this low.
Number 9 for me is Insomnia. Not my favorite Nolan flick, just never really captured my attention. Interesting story script throughout, but just didn't hook me like most of Nolan's other films have done.
My number 8 is Insomnia. This movie doesn't use any of Christopher Nolan's usuals on or off screen, and so it kind of feels like some other movie that he just dropped into as the director. Having watched this movie now that I know who Christopher Nolan is, it's hard for me to take it as it probably felt at the time, and with the context of his later career, it just doesn't measure up for me.
Number 8, I went with The Prestige, which I do love, so it was kind of difficult to place it at number 8. There are certain qualities I love about it, but overall, I feel like just as each Nolan film, I feel like has built on each other. I feel like it hasn't held up for me as strong as some of the other ones. Still, regardless, a great flick.
My number 8 is Insomnia. This is probably Christopher Nolan's most underrated film, featuring Al Pacino as a cop who is working a case in Alaska where the sun never goes down. He is trying to catch a killer who, in a kind of cool stroke of the movie, is played by Robin Williams and is introduced very early, and is driven crazy by both the sun and the chase of the killer. Insomnia examines the sacrifices we make for our legacy.
Number 7, I selected The Dark Knight Rises. Overall, a beautiful mainstream picture, but the film did not hold up. I mean, we had Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight before it. I just felt like the hype around it didn't necessarily carry it, but I did enjoy the film.
My number 7 is The Prestige. The Prestige is a dark tale of two magicians trying to one-up each other. It's based on a novel by Christopher Priest. Nolan takes a look at the lengths we go to try to exact revenge. The Prestige is a wonderful puzzle box of a film featuring great performances from Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale that I know a lot of people have higher on their lists.
My number 7 is Memento. I'm aware that I have Christopher Nolan's first real signature magic trick script fairly low on my list. I've only seen this movie once and I loved it, but I am skeptical about how well that twist will hold up for me on future viewings.
Okay, number 6 is Batman Begins. Again, the movie that redefined how you watch a superhero movie. Okay, I felt like Christian Bale really carried the film. I felt like there were some great connections between real life and superhero, blending that genre.
My number 6 is The Dark Knight Rises. This movie inherits a lot of the polished confidence that The Dark Knight has, but for me it just doesn't feel quite as tightly executed. The movie feels like a slight disappointment, but I do think that that disappointment comes from comparing it to its predecessor.
My number 6 is The Dark Knight Rises. Initially I had this lower on my list, but after watching it again, I was really struck by the ambitious storytelling, as well as the weaving together of the ideas, the concepts, and the storylines from Batman Begins and The Dark Knight in such a seamless way. Some of the climax is a little bit obvious, but I think that the movie sticks the landing nonetheless.
My number 5 is Interstellar. When I heard the concept of Interstellar as Christopher Nolan does space with Matthew McConaughey, I never thought that would have turned out so well. I think it's one of the strongest pairings between Christopher Nolan and his go-to composer Hans Zimmer, and I'm especially impressed by the way the film's ending doesn't feel too hokey or silly.
My number 5 is Dunkirk. Christopher Nolan's latest movie is a war film with ticking clock intensity that tells the story of the evacuation of Dunkirk during World War II. Christopher Nolan dispenses with backstories, dispenses with any sort of character examination, and instead looks at each soldier as someone just trying to survive. Dunkirk grabs you in a vice grip and never lets go.
Okay, my number 5 is Memento, which is a lot lower than many people would argue. I find it a really incredible script, a really incredible story. The way that time is used, for me it just doesn't hold up. It's for me, a little dated, but I also really enjoy this movie. It's hard to pick. These are all great movies.
My number 4 is Batman Begins. Batman Begins reinvented and reinvigorated the comic book genre and gave the cliched origin story a much-needed facelift. Christian Bale and Liam Neeson are both fantastic and anchor the story with realism. The ways in which Batman's persona was tied into what he went through in his past was beautiful.
Okay, my number 4 is Dunkirk. This movie threw me for a loop. I was not familiar with the history behind this, but as I learned more about that and the way it was pieced together, I felt like it was a big budget movie that captured a lot of the things that I love about small cinema.
My number 4 is Inception. Inception set a new standard for original big-budget blockbusters, and it still feels just as fresh today. Nolan's script walks a brilliant line of introducing complex plot points, but also helping the audience follow along and feel rewarded in the end.
Okay, number 3, The Dark Knight. With Heath Ledger, Christian Bale together, solid flick, dynamite as far as good guy and bad guy, and the cinema was fantastic.
My number 3 is The Prestige. This is arguably the last time that Christopher Nolan favored an intimate scale over the more big-budget spectacle that he's done since then. It's definitely lesser seen than most of Christopher Nolan's body of work. However, the performances and the minor humming score create a very unique atmosphere that make it rewarding to watch multiple times.
My number 3 is Inception. Arguably the most clever blockbuster of all time. Inception basically invents science from the ground up, creating an exciting heist movie that also examines the way we are all shaped by our past irrevocably and driven mad by our goals for the future.
My number 2 is Dunkirk. Christopher Nolan is one of the few directors that could take a genre that I tend to avoid and turn it into my favorite movie of the year so far. The combined effect of the cinematography, the score, the performances, and the narrative structure make this his most technically impressive film to me.
My number 2 is The Dark Knight. I mean, what can I add about what is, in my opinion, the best comic book movie ever made? The Dark Knight features an Oscar-winning supporting turn by Heath Ledger, and for my money, it is the most simultaneously hilarious and terrifying performance of all time. The story culminates in a climax that posits that deep down, all humans are good. The ending of The Dark Knight finds the perfect balance between realism and superheroism, if I may make up a word. I will always be amazed by what Nolan and his team accomplished within the framework of a comic book story.
My number 2 is Inception. The idea of Inception, the entire dream within a dream, the way that blends together was fascinating. I was on the edge of my seat for most of that film, and it's got replay value. I can watch it pretty much anytime, anywhere.
My number one is Memento. Though Memento is one of Christopher Nolan's earliest movies, it was based on a short story by his brother Jonah Nolan, or Jonathan Nolan. It is still, to me, his most indelible and his most innovative. Putting the audience in the mind of a man who cannot make new memories and is trying to catch the person who killed his wife, Nolan did something that no filmmaker had ever done before. For its complexity, its surprises, and above all, its ingenuity, Memento is my favorite Christopher Nolan movie.
My number one was Interstellar. A lot of people have this a lot lower. For me, the scope of this movie being such a large movie, and then the ambition of taking space and science and keeping it grounded semi-realistically was impressive. I felt like Nolan did a lot of good things, and to me it's almost in a two-part movie. The first half of it I feel like is completely accessible to about anyone that has a family. The second half I think is where some of the flaws can come in, but I loved it. It's a masterpiece.
My number one is The Dark Knight. I've never seen another superhero movie that feels so little like a superhero movie. The Dark Knight is action spectacle done at its finest. It's filled with a cast of well-acted characters who remain compelling until the end. It's jam-packed for its entire running time, and I'm never bored for a minute of it.
So, that's where we each personally have Christopher Nolan's movies ranked. Just for your information, I do have this written down. On Netflix right now, you can see Memento, The Prestige, and Following. On HBO Go or HBO Now, you can see The Dark Knight and Insomnia. On Showtime streaming service, you can see The Prestige. Dunkirk is currently in theaters, and the rest you can rent to stream many places online, and of course, they are on DVD and Blu-ray if you have access to a library or someplace like that. Thank you. Die!